Hello, everyone. Once again, I have to start off by saying I hope I wasn't cut off in the middle of my sentence introducing myself. But in the meantime, the camera seems to be working now. So, welcome to topic 2 for our week on the Plains Wars in American History 2. Now, this week, or for this topic, since I gave you a pretty big whopper on the first topic, spent a lot of time, went a little bit over on how I usually go, we're going to have a little bit more of an informal lesson this time that's going to focus again on that historical memory I love to mention so much, and Sand Creek in particular. Now, unfortunately, a lot of you have probably not heard about Sand Creek, but it is one of the more infamous battles or massacres of the entire Plains Wars, so I think it's important to discuss particularly how this one has been interpreted throughout our nation's history. So, to look at, first off, before I get into that, however, I do have a quick announcement. Like I said, this is Labor Day week. Labor Day will be tomorrow, actually, at the time of me filming this. So because of that, I will go ahead and push due dates back an extra day. Since this is a totally online class, I don't have to cancel class or anything, so I'm still posting the normal number of lectures, but everything will be due on Saturday this week instead of on Friday. I unfortunately did not reflect that in my PowerPoint from the first topic, so hopefully you're viewing this, maybe you're viewing this one first and you'll realize that, but hopefully you still did view the first one first, of course. But the PowerPoints will be changed before I post them on Moodle, so do remember the due dates are all going to be an extra day, and this will be reflected on Moodle by Sunday evening. So essentially, as soon as I post this, I'll change the due dates on Moodle. So remember, since it's Labor Day week, you have an extra day to get everything done. Any questions about that, please let me know as soon as you can. Now, in the meantime, we'll start things off with key terms like I always do. We're going to talk about, of course, the Sand Creek Massacre. Really, it's just going to be one big term study today. We'll look at John Shivington, who was the commander of the American forces involved in Sand Creek. We'll look at Silas Soule, who was a witness and a member of the American forces at Sand Creek. And we'll also look at some of these Sand Creek monuments that have popped up over the years. Because as I mentioned in our Lost Cause lecture, sand monuments are a very important part of how history is remembered. No less so in the Plains Wars than it was in the Civil War. Also, just a repeat of the deadlines. Won't spend much time on this because I already covered it in my last video. But do remember, your first content quiz is coming up on September the 11th at 5 p.m. Your final essay, actually, I just remembered, I did it again. Remember, these due dates will be updated and changed. You'll have an extra day. So actually, your content quiz is going to be due on September the 12th at 5 p.m. So that one is going to be changed. However, the rest of these, unless there is some other school scheduling issue, these due dates should not be changed. So the final essay thesis statement will still be on September the 18th at 5 p.m. As I said last time and showed you in the last video, all this information can be found in the final essay prompt, and everything will be turned in that tab on Moodle. Your writing assignment 2 is, of course, coming up the Friday after that on the 25th. So keep these due dates in mind, and once again, remember, this PowerPoint will be changed. This one is actually going to be due September the 12th. So you're getting an extra day for your content quiz. Alright, just to give a little bit of background information on Sand Creek before we get into the historical memory. This was actually one of the earlier conflicts of the entire Plains Wars. It was based all the way back in 1851 from a treaty called the Fort Laramie Treaty. This was a treaty between the American government and various Native American tribes, which guaranteed the area north of the Arkansas River, which you can see somewhat in this picture right here, to the Nebraska border, to the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes specifically. I do apologize if I'm mispronouncing that, but as you probably noticed at this point, pronunciation is not my strong suit. Settlers were still pouring in search of gold for gold in the Colorado Rockies, so their territory is being restricted even further, as we talked a lot about last time. Now, February 8th, 1861, Chief Black Kettle, after all these settlers kept pouring in, he eventually led a delegation from both tribes to try to accept a new settlement. This led to a new treaty called the Treaty of Fort Wise. As a result of this treaty, the two tribes lost all but 600 square miles of their land, and Black Kettle only led a small portion of the Cheyenne during the negotiations. Now, we talked about this a little bit last week. Why do you think that's the case, and why is that such a problem? Again, imaginary pause for my listeners at home. Yeah, as you hopefully remember from last time, a lot of the Native Americans were not united on whether to accept these reservation deals. So Black Kettle is only leading a very small group. The problem with this is, one, if trouble does arise, which of course, as you probably guessed it did, he doesn't have a very large force backing him up. Also, this ensures that there's still going to be people who are fighting against the American government out there, so there's not really much of a chance of peace. So this treaty was really only a very shoddy band-aid attempt at best. Didn't really solve much. In fact, by 1864, Black Kettle and some of the other chiefs had to go back to John Evans, who was the governor of Colorado at the time, to try to negotiate a whole new peace. As there was this, and one of the problematic aspects of this peace is that it was part of a policy the government had been conducting at the time to try to get Native Americans to seek protection from forts. So essentially, they'd force them to live around these forts so they could be under American control. And it was actually got to the point where often the protection was denied anyway. So not only were they forcing them to try to seek protection, a lot of times it wasn't even given. Black Kettle was actually treated at first, it seemed, better than some of the other groups. He was allowed to lead his group to Fort Lynn, which was located in Colorado, and specifically given permission to hunt deer in that area. Now, unfortunately, this obviously did not go exactly as Black Kettle planned. Most of the men actually refused, like I mentioned. They were not very united. Most of the men refused to relocate to Sand Creek. So eventually, 75 men were the only ones who were left, and these were mostly the old or the sick, who were not capable of still continuing guerrilla warfare. Black Kettle actually, once he got to this camp, likely realizing the futility of really fighting at this point, flew a U.S. and white flag above his camp at the direct advice of the fort commander. So, why is this significant to keep in mind? Again, viewers at home. Oh yeah, this probably suggests that he wasn't prepared to fight and was not, more importantly, preparing to fight. The intention was to live peacefully here and just hunt deer. Meanwhile, U.S. Army Colonel John Chivington was leading the 3rd Colorado Cavalry and had been sent to the area to protect Denver. This was actually a result of John Evans, again the Colorado governor, popularizing the idea that the area needed to be protected from Indian attacks. Why do you think he would popularize this idea? Again, give an awkward pause. Teaching online is the worst. Yeah, as you might imagine, there of course could have been some truth to it, because again, as we talked about last week, there was violence on both sides throughout the Plains Wars. However, it is also possible, and many historians theorize, that this was essentially a political stunt. If you convince the government that you need help to fight off various Indian attacks and violence, you get a lot more resources and troops from the government, and if you successfully put these revolts down, it makes you look tough and can enhance your political career. So most consider this to be a political stunt on the part of John Evans. By November the 29th of 1864, after the soldiers had had a heavy night of drinking, and they were ordered to attack by John Chivington. By the end of the battle, 9 soldiers were killed, and 148 Native Americans were killed, over half of these being women and children. Because remember, not many men were left in the entire camp. Now, one of the reasons I want to go over this so much is based on something I actually just said. For a long time, Sand Creek was called a battle. We're going to talk a little bit about how that battle, or whatever you want to call it, has been remembered throughout history, and why it's important to talk about that. So, first I want to go over a little bit of some of the testimony from Sand Creek. Keep in mind a couple of things. These testimonies come from formal investigations that the government did conduct by 1865 into the nature of the battle. However, keep in mind, despite everything you're about to see here, no one was formally charged with any crime. No one involved with Sand Creek was charged with anything. Now, several of these pieces of the testimony were made public regarding the massacre. All of these testimonies were quickly made public after these formal investigations. For example, John S. Smith said, "I saw the bodies of those lying there cut all to pieces, worse mutilated than any I ever saw before. The women cut all to pieces. With knives, scalped, their brains knocked out, children 2 or 3 months old, all ages lying there, from sucking infants up to warriors. By whom were they mutilated? By the United States troops." Robert Bent said, saw one squaw lying on the bank whose leg had been broken. A soldier came up with a drawn saber. She raised her arm to protect herself. He struck, breaking her arm. She rolled over and raised her other arm. He struck, breaking that, and then left without killing her. I saw one squaw cut open with an unborn child lying by her side. Stan Hoig said, fingers and ears were cut off the bodies for the jewelry they carried. The body of White Antelope, lying solitary in the creek bed, was a prime target. Besides scalping him, the soldiers cut off his nose, ears, and the last part for a tobacco pouch. Ashbury Bird said, I went over the ground soon after the battle. I should judge there were between 400 and 500 Indians killed. Nearly all men, women, and children were scalped. I saw one woman whose privates had been mutilated. So again, despite all this testimony, do keep in mind, no one was charged with any crime. We'll talk a little bit about the importance of that in just a second. Now, we're going to get into more detail about the historical memory. For many years, a monument existed in Colorado called the Colorado Civil War Volunteers. This was set up in 1909, so a little over 100 years ago. Now, just speaking about this in general, why are monuments like this so important? Again, imaginary pause for the audience. Alright, so again, as you probably remember from last week, and even a little bit of what I talked about on the first topic, these can be very important and positive ways to memorialize the past. For in particular, many of us would like a Civil War memorial because it memorializes and respects all of those who gave their lives fighting in the Civil War. So it's an important way to remember history and to honor people who made big sacrifices and deserve to be remembered. So again, these monuments can be very important. However, as we're going to get into specifically here, these memorials can often have a dark side as well, particularly in remembering Sand Creek. Now, as I said, this is the statue of the memorial. On the statue, you can also see a list of some of the various battles that are being memorialized here. I'll give you a second to look over it and to think of what a major problem with this is. Awkward pause again, I'm sorry. I thought I'd have to stare at the camera at this point. But again, many of you probably already guessed it without even finding it. But if you look over here on the bottom right, you can see that Sand Creek, Colorado, in 1864, is being listed as one of these battles in the Civil War. So, why is that such a problem? Again, it's very similar to what we mentioned with the Battle of the Greasy Grass / Little Bighorn last time. A lot of times these monuments, if a massacre like Sand Creek is on one of these monuments, it again implies a little bit like what the Frederick Jackson Turner thesis was talking about. That this was a good and noble battle that deserves to be respected and memorialized, and that it was a group of brave heroes fighting against the savagery of the West. Again, very problematic, I think we can all agree. So also, I think that's another reason why these monuments tend to be so important. They can often be used to skew history and to affect people's historical memory and cause them to potentially have inaccurate representations or beliefs about what actually occurred in some historical event. To go a little bit over that as well, you have some Sand Creek primary documents assigned for this week. If you haven't already viewed those, make sure you do so. That's going to come up in future assignments and things we do throughout the next few days. What I'd like you to do is make a chart going over these primary documents. This will not be necessarily an assignment, but it could help you with future things down the road. Make sure you keep in mind who the author is and why that's significant. Make sure you keep in mind who the audience is and why that's significant. Try to figure out, based on these two, what you figured out up here, what the overall purpose of these documents were, and be prepared to explain their historical significance. The first group came primarily from the Rocky Mountain News editorials, and the second major part is a testimony from Colonel J.M. Shivington. So again, Shivington's getting his testimony here. Now, the next thing I want to do is go a little bit over how some of the major players of this battle were remembered and behaved after the battle was over. John Shivington was quoted after the Sand Creek Massacre, blank, any man who sympathizes with Indians. I have come to kill Indians, and I believe it is right and honorable to use any means under God's heaven to kill Indians. So, as you can clearly see here, he was a big believer in what would eventually be known as the frontier thesis. He views himself as a civilizing force who is given a divine right or a manifest destiny to go out and fight people who aren't civilized. After Sand Creek was over, Shimmigan had a spotty career. He resigned from the army in 1865 and actually married his daughter-in-law Sarah after his son was dead. He divorced her in 1870. He was divorced in 1871 due to claims of non-support for their children. The only real negative thing he suffered from the Sand Creek massacre was that he was forced to withdraw from Colorado politics. He was quoted often as saying, "I stand by Sand Creek," and again, as I mentioned, he was never formally punished for Sand Creek. So again, why is this important? Alright, just again, to summarize my thoughts again really quickly, I just think it's another example of the importance of historical memory. This event was still being portrayed as a battle at the time, so no one wanted to charge him with anything because that meant we would have to reframe how we understood what happened at Sand Creek. No one wanted to call it a massacre yet, we still considered it a battle. Now, I don't want to be too negative today because I know this has already been a very negative topic, so to get a little bit more positive, we're going to look at the testimony of Silas Soule for a second, which is also included in that primary source packet I gave you. Now, he was a member of the Union Army as well and was a captain serving under Shivington. He, along with a few others, were notable in refusing the order to participate in Sand Creek. So when that order was given to attack, Silas Soule did not participate. He actually testified against Shivington despite death threats in those formal investigations I was talking about earlier. Unfortunately, however, he was murdered 80 days after the massacre and 3 weeks after he got married. So I know I said I was going to be more positive, but this is, of course, still a very dark subject. But it is important to remember that many people did still refuse to participate in some of the things that were going on at this time. Now, one thing I want to mention, again, of the more positive aspect of historical memory. In 2010, in Denver, the Silas Soule Memorial was created. During this memorial's unveiling, the Bishop Elaine Stanofsky, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, had this following quote: "Methodists were key leaders of the massacre. Many of the leaders of the attackers were in fact Methodists. We need to come to understand how Christian people could engage in these acts of wanton violence. We need to understand that Methodist churches in Colorado are built on a foundation of injustice. We can't change the past, but we can form new relationships of mutual respect and honor. I'm here to build relationships that offer hope for the future." Now, what can we maybe learn from this monument a little bit? And to maybe make that thought a little bit easier, how does this monument compare to the original Colorado Volunteers or the Colorado Soldiers monument? Again, this is a little bit less awkward of a pause because this is actually something I'd like you to consider. Alright, as far as I'm concerned, and this might be a little bit my own internal bias, but I think based on the historical facts of Sand Creek, this is a more effective use of historical memory. It's not about necessarily just condemning everyone in the past and condemning ourselves because of what our ancestors did. It's about making a memorial that recognizes what occurred in the past, is honest about it, and attempts to spread that information in order to help people grow and be better in the future. So again, it's not about trying to change the past or erase the past. That's a big thing that's brought up in Confederate memorial debates today. People don't want to see the past erased. This isn't an attempt to do that. This is an attempt to make sure that memorials show, again, relationships of respect and honor and offer hope for the future. So it's portraying the past again in an honest way, coming to understand exactly what happened and not lying about it, and trying to reframe it in a way that helps build hope and actual honesty and awareness for the future. So I probably repeated myself a little bit, but that's because I do actually feel very passionate about this. This is a much more positive way to portray the past than trying to sugarcoat everything, like many ways this earlier Colorado Volunteers monument attempted to do. So please do keep that in mind. I think that's an important thing we can all learn from. Now, how should we maybe deal with all these other things to keep in mind? How should we deal with these monuments in Sand Creek? and what should maybe be done with the old Sand Creek, the old Colorado Volunteers monument I mentioned earlier. That's another reason why I wanted to bring this monument up. Many times today, people are still obviously debating on what to do with all the old Confederate statues. Should we destroy them completely? Should we leave them alone? Should we alter them in some way? These are just a few of the options we potentially have, and I'm sure many of you who are watching this have very strong feelings about it as well. So again, I think that this Silas Soul Memorial is a great model to learn from. However, fortunately, we also do have the new Sand Creek monument to look at. Later, you can see this monument was added just a few years ago, actually. Trying to get my face out of the way so I can actually read it. Here we go. So, essentially, I'll try to go through this as quickly as I can. The controversy surrounding the Civil War monument has become a symbol of Coloradans' struggles to understand and take responsibility for our past. So again, like the Silas Soul Memorial, it's not about erasing the past, it's about taking responsibility for the past. On November 29, 1864, Colorado's 1st and 3rd Cavalry, commanded by Colonel John Shivington, attacked a Chief Black Kettle's peaceful camp of Cheyenne and Arapaho, probably pronouncing that wrong, Indians, on the banks of Sand Creek, about 160 miles southeast of here. In the surprise attack, soldiers killed more than 150 of the village's 500 inhabitants. Most of the victims were elderly men, women, and children. Though some civilians and military personnel immediately denounced the attack as a massacre, others claimed the village was a legitimate target. Again, why it was called a battle for so long. This Civil War monument, paid for by funds from the Pioneers Association and the state, was erected on July 24, 1909, to honor all Colorado soldiers who fought in battles of the Civil War in Colorado and elsewhere. By designating Sand Creek a battle, the monument's designers mischaracterized the actual events. Protests led by some Sand Creek descendants and others throughout the 20th century have since led to the widespread recognition of the tragedy as the Sand Creek Massacre. This plaque was authorized by Senate Joint Resolution, whatever the number was. So again, I think this is a great model for how we can deal with some of these problematic monuments. We don't have to try to erase the past. What we need to do is to again take responsibility for it and recognize the reality of the past instead of trying to reframe it in a way that suits whatever our agendas may have to be. So again, just wanted to go over that. I think this is a great example of how we can deal with monuments and is a big reason why I wanted to focus on Sand Creek in the first place. So again, please just keep all of that in mind. I know I promised sort of a less formal lesson today, and I hope I delivered on that, but I do apologize that it was a bit depressing, but I think it's an important topic to cover. In the meantime, until I see you all again digitally, again, your first content quiz is coming up on September the 12th. Remember, this will be changed. Your thesis statements are on the 18th. Your writing assignment, the next one, is on the 25th. Any questions about these assignment due dates, please let me know as soon as possible. Have a great rest of your week and try to enjoy your weekend. Adios.